The night was a blur of rain and road, a constant rhythm of tires cutting through water and wipers fighting to keep up. The storm had rolled in fast, the sky dark and swollen with clouds. I'd been on the road for hours, my eyes fixed on the stretch of interstate ahead. The only other souls brave or foolish enough to be out here were fellow truckers, each of us keeping our distance in the relentless downpour. I was used to storms, used to the isolation, used to the long stretches of highway where it felt like the world didn't exist beyond the truck. But tonight, there was something different about the storm. The way the rain seemed to blur everything, like the world was sinking into a fog of uncertainty. About halfway through my route, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a blur, headlights coming up behind me, maybe another vehicle overtaking. But these lights didn't fade. They stayed too close, almost uncomfortably close. I squinted, trying to make out the shape of the car, a black sedan. It wasn't the first time I'd seen a car out here at this hour, but there was something off about this one. The driver wasn't just speeding up to pass me, he was swerving erratically, moving between lanes as if he couldn't hold control. I slowed, instinctively giving the sedan space. But it didn't ease off. It matched my speed, stayed in my blind spot, and that gut feeling I'd learned to trust after years on the road started to nag at me. This guy was dangerous. The sedan surged forward, pulling up next to my rig. I glanced over, my breath catching. There was a man in the driver's seat, his face obscured by the shadows of the hood pulled low over his head, but I could see his eyes. Cold, focused, and in his hand, something metallic flashed briefly, a gun. My heart dropped. I could feel my pulse quicken. I wasn't new to road rage, to the reckless drivers who thought they owned the highway. But this was different. This man wasn't just angry. He was deliberate. He was playing a game, and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be the target or the pawn. I held my ground. The truck wasn't fast enough to outrun him in these conditions, not with the rain slicking the pavement and the visibility barely reaching a few yards. But I had one advantage: the road. I knew it. I knew every twist and turn, every curve. I wasn't about to let him push me into making a mistake. I was about to hit the air horn when something unexpected happened. The sedan lurched. The man behind the wheel swerved violently, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. I looked back in time to see the car's rear end slide out from under it. For a moment, I thought he was done for, his reckless pursuit finally catching up with him. But no, the car didn't stop. The sedan regained control quickly, but by then I was already speeding ahead. I pushed the truck harder, my engine roaring through the rain, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. Minutes passed, but the sedan stayed on my tail, the headlights a constant, oppressive glare in my mirrors. I could feel my anxiety building, the weight of the chase settling on my shoulders. Just then, luck, or something else came into play. The road ahead bent slightly to the right, a gentle curve. But for a driver like the one chasing me, it was enough to throw off his rhythm. I could see the rear tires of his sedan sliding out of control as he tried to stay right behind me. It was all I needed. I swerved to the right, veering onto the shoulder, my tires skimming the wet gravel. I heard the sedan's tires screeching again, but by the time he regained control, I was 100 yards ahead, pushing the truck as hard as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, heart pounding, hands still shaking from the adrenaline. The storm had passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely free of whatever had been chasing me. I pulled into the lot, the flickering lights above casting long shadows. The parking area was quiet now, only a few trucks scattered across the lot. I climbed out of the cab, stretching my legs, grateful for the break. But something about the stillness didn't sit right with me. I made my way into the diner, my feet heavy with exhaustion. A hot cup of coffee felt like the only thing that could ground me in that moment. I sat down, hands still trembling from the near miss. That's when I overheard it. Two truckers at the counter were talking in low voices, their words carrying across the room. Yeah, the black sedan. Same guy, I've heard about him, been following trucks for weeks now. The hell's he doing? Just some random psycho on the road? Nah, there's been stories. People who've been followed by him, they just disappear. Never heard from again. Some say he's just out to intimidate, but I don't buy it. There's something else. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened to the truckers talk about the very thing I just experienced. That car, that driver, wasn't random. He wasn't just a threat to me. He'd been hunting people for weeks, maybe longer. I looked up, my eyes scanning the diner. It felt too quiet, too empty. But there was something in the air now, a tension I hadn't noticed before. Disappeared? I couldn't help but ask, my voice sounding too loud in the otherwise silent space. One of the truckers glanced over at me, his face unreadable. Yeah. People who get too close to that guy, they vanish, like they never existed. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I paid my tab, not saying another word. My hands were still shaking as I walked out into the cold night air. The storm had let up, but I wasn't sure if the real storm had passed. As I stepped out into the parking lot, I froze. The black sedan was parked near the back, its headlights dimmed. The figure in the hoodie was there, standing beside the car, facing me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The truckers had been right. I hadn't just survived some random encounter. This was something else entirely. And it wasn't over. The rain had been coming down for hours. Hard, icy, relentless. The highway was slick with a layer of ice, and my windshield wipers barely kept up. The radio was a crackling mess of static, the only thing coming through being some old country song, muffled beneath the drone of my truck's engine. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles turning white as I guided the rig down I-80 in the middle of nowhere. 12 hours on the road. My eyelids felt like weights, and the white lines on the pavement blurred together. I knew I needed to stop soon, but the next truck stop was at least 50 miles away. The storm wasn't letting up. It was ice now, not rain. If I wasn't careful, I could end up in a ditch. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought I was seeing things. A shadow, barely visible through the icy curtain. But as I got closer, I could make out a figure standing by the side of the road. A hitchhiker. In this weather? I muttered under my breath. No way, not tonight. But then something made me look in the rearview mirror. The guy was still there. He wasn't drenched, not even a bit. His clothes were dry, his stance was odd, stiff, like he was standing at attention. My stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. I kept driving, telling myself it was just the exhaustion. The hours on the road were messing with my head, but not 5 miles later, there he was again. Same position, same uniform. My heart skipped. How had he gotten ahead of me? There hadn't been any exits, no side roads. I slowed down, squinting through the rain. He turned his head toward me. Our eyes met for a split second. His face was pale, almost ghostly, his eyes deep set, sad. But more than that, like there was something desperate in them. I don't know why, but I hit the brakes. The truck slid a little on the ice, but I managed to stop. I stared at him through the side mirror. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like he was moving through thick mud. My chest was tight, but I rolled down the window, the cold air biting at my face. "You need a ride?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was soft, almost lost in the sound of the rain. "I need a ride." I hesitated. Everything in me said to drive away, to keep going, but something in his voice pulled me in. "Where to?" I asked, hoping he'd say something that made sense. "Just up the road," he said. "I won't be any trouble." I sighed. The storm was getting worse, the road more dangerous. "All right, get in, but make it quick. This weather's no joke." He nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. As he settled in, the air inside the cab turned unnaturally cold. I cranked the heat, but it didn't help. He sat there still, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. I could feel my skin crawl, but I tried to focus on the road. "Name's Jack," I said, breaking the silence. "What's yours?" There was a long pause before he spoke, like he was digging something up from deep in his past. "Thomas," he said. "Private Thomas Harlow." I glanced at him, trying to make sense of it. "What's a soldier like you doing out here in this weather?" He didn't respond right away, and I thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. But then he said, quietly, like it hurt to say it, "I'm trying to get home." His voice was distant, as though he wasn't here at all, but somewhere far away. I didn't press. We rode in silence for a while. The wipers slashed back and forth, the engine hummed, and the storm just kept pounding down. 20 minutes later, he suddenly sat up straight, his eyes fixed on something ahead. "Stop here," he said, his voice firm. I frowned. "Here?" There's nothing out there. Please, he said more urgently now. I need to get out. I pulled over, the tires crunching on the icy shoulder. Thomas opened the door, stepped out into the storm, and before I could say anything, he turned to me. Thank you, Jack, he said, his voice soft like it had a weight behind it. You're a good man. I watched as he walked off into the blizzard, his figure disappearing into the night. My heart was pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I couldn't explain why. I sat there, staring at the road ahead, not sure what had just happened. My hands were shaking, sweat beading on my forehead. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of him. The drive to the truck stop was a blur. I was too rattled, my thoughts bouncing between the road and what had just happened. By the time I reached the stop, I felt drained, physically and mentally. Inside the diner, the warmth hit me like a brick. The place was quiet, just a few truckers nursing coffee. I sat at the counter and ordered a cup, my hands still trembling. The waitress, a woman with a kind face, noticed my state and gave me a worried look. "You okay, hon?" she asked. I gave a half-hearted laugh, though it came out more like a croak. Long night. Bad weather. She nodded, poured my coffees, and I took a sip, trying to steady my nerves. But then I saw it, the photo on the wall behind the counter. A black and white picture of a group of soldiers standing in front of a barracks. My heart stopped. There he was. I pointed to the photo, my hand shaking. "Who's that?" I asked. The waitress turned to look, then smiled. "Oh, that's an old picture from World War II. Those boys trained here before they shipped out." I swallowed hard, staring at the photo. "What happened to them?" Her smile faded. "Most of them didn't come back. That one there." She pointed to Thomas. "He was killed in action. Only 19. A real shame." The world spun for a moment. My throat tightened, and I couldn't find the words. The waitress must have seen the look on my face because she reached out and touched my arm. "You okay, hon?" I nodded, though I wasn't. "Yeah, just tired," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I finished my coffee in silence, my mind racing, too jumbled to make sense of anything. When I left the diner, the storm had passed, and the sky was clear. I stood outside for a moment, looking up at the stars. I whispered a quiet thank you to Thomas, not knowing how or why he'd appeared, but feeling a strange peace settle over me. Maybe he wasn't just a soldier. Maybe he was something else, someone who needed to be remembered. The rain had been falling for hours, a relentless, pounding rhythm on the roof of my cab. The wipers struggled to keep up, slapping back and forth in a losing battle against the sheets of water streaming down the windshield. I'd been driving through the Midwest for what felt like forever, the highway slicing through endless fields of corn and soybeans. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel small, like you were just a speck in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you could drive for miles and not see another soul. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver, the kind of cargo that makes you nervous if you think about it too much. High-value freight, the sort that attracts the wrong kind of attention. But I'd been doing this job for over 20 years, and I knew how to handle myself. At least, I thought I did. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the road into a slick, shimmering ribbon. My headlights cut through the gloom, reflecting off the wet asphalt, but beyond that, it was just darkness. The kind of darkness that feels heavy, like it's pressing in on you. I tightened my grip on the wheel and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The radio was playing some old country song, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was on the road, on the cargo, on the long night ahead. That's when I saw them. Up ahead, just off the shoulder, there was a car parked at an angle, its hazard lights blinking faintly through the rain. A figure stood beside it, waving their arms frantically. My first instinct was to keep driving. You don't stop for strangers on a lonely stretch of highway, not in the middle of the night, not in this kind of weather. But something about the way they were waving, the desperation in their movements, made me hesitate. Maybe it was the father in me, the part that always wondered if that was my kid out there, stranded and scared. Whatever it was, I eased off the gas and pulled over, my rig shuddering to a stop about 50 yards past the car. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, the rain soaking through my jacket in seconds. The figure was running toward me now, a man in a hoodie, his face obscured by the shadows. I raised a hand in what I hoped was a reassuring gesture. "You okay?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. Yeah, thanks for stopping," the man said, his voice tight with what sounded like relief. "My car broke down and my phone's dead. I just need a ride to the next town." I hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right. The way he was standing, the way his eyes darted around like he was looking for something or someone. But before I could say anything, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw the other one. He'd come out of nowhere, his face hidden beneath a hood and mask. The first guy, the one who'd waved me down, was suddenly a lot closer, and I realized he was holding something, a knife glinting in the beam of my flashlight. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "We don't want to hurt you. Just hand over the keys to your rig and we'll be on our way." My heart was pounding now, adrenaline surging through my veins. I'd heard stories about truckers getting robbed, about hijackings on lonely stretches of highway, but I'd never thought it would happen to me. Not here. Not now. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You don't want to do this. The cargo's insured, but if you take it, they'll come after you. Hard. It's not worth it." The guy with the knife stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "We're not here for the cargo," he said. "We're here for the truck. Now hand over the keys." I glanced around, my mind racing. The rain was still coming down, the sound of it drowning out everything else. There were no other cars on the road, no lights in the distance. It was just me and them, and I was outnumbered. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I dropped the flashlight and lunged at the guy with the knife, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard. He let out a grunt of pain, and the knife clattered to the ground. The other one was on me in an instant, but I was bigger than he was, and I had the advantage of surprise. I swung my elbow into his face, feeling the satisfying crunch of bone beneath the impact. He stumbled back, clutching his nose, and I turned back to the first guy who was scrambling to pick up the knife. I didn't give him the chance. I kicked the knife away, sending it skittering across the wet pavement, and then I grabbed him by the front of his hoodie and slammed him against the side of my rig. His head hit the metal with a dull thud, and he groaned, his legs buckling beneath him. The second guy was still on the ground, moaning and holding his face. I stood over him, breathing hard, my fists clenched. "You picked the wrong trucker," I growled. "Now get the hell out of here before I call the cops." For a moment, they just stared at me, their eyes wide with fear. Then they scrambled to their feet, stumbling toward their car. They piled in, the engine roaring to life, and then they were gone, disappearing into the rain and the darkness. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the rain soaking through my clothes. My hands were shaking and my heart was still pounding, but I was alive. I was alive, and they were gone. I climbed back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. The radio was still playing, some upbeat tune that felt completely out of place. I turned it off and sat there for a moment, just listening to the rain. My hands were still shaking and my ribs ached where one of them had landed a punch, but I was in one piece. That was what mattered. I reached for my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and I gave her the details. The car, the men, the stretch of highway where it had happened. She assured me someone would be out to take a report, but I knew the odds of catching them were slim. They were probably long gone by now, vanishing into the maze of back roads and small towns that dotted the Midwest. Still, it felt better to have it on record. Just in case. The cops showed up about 20 minutes later, their headlights cutting through the rain. I stepped out to meet them, my boots splashing in the puddles that had formed on the shoulder. Two officers, one older with a graying mustache, and the other younger, fresh-faced, listened as I recounted what had happened. The older one nodded along, his expression grim, while the younger one kept glancing at my rig like he was sizing it up. They took my statement, asked if I needed medical attention, and told me they'd keep an eye out for the car. I thanked them, though I didn't expect much to come of it. These kinds of things rarely did. Back in the cab, I sat for a while, letting the adrenaline drain out of me. The rain kept falling, steady and unrelenting, and the wipers kept their rhythm. I thought about calling my wife, but it was late, and she'd only worry. Better to tell her in the morning, when the night didn't feel so close, and the memory wasn't so raw. I put the rig in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out ahead, dark and wet, but familiar. The kind of road I'd driven 1,000 times before. I adjusted my grip on the wheel, checked my mirrors, and settled in for the long haul. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was I.